and I'm just going to give you guys a brief background on her. So Nour Goda is a Muslim Arab American and native of the Bronx, New York. She was born in Damascus and is Palestinian and Syrian descent. In 2015, Nour converted after having left the fold of Islam for nearly a decade, recognizing that her experience is not unique and that there is a dire need among Arabs and Muslims to address highly sensitive and controversial matters, such as atheism. Nour decided to develop a multimedia initiative dedicated to candid inter-community dialogue. Thus, she launched the Between Arabs project. It's a podcast and a blog. Today, Nour writes and speaks about many of the same topics from a more Islamically informed perspective, and this year she's pursuing the Islamic Essentials program with Darul Qasam. So I'm just going to, without further ado, I'm going to hand it off to Nour.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I begin in the name of Allah, the most merciful, the most gracious, ruler of all the world. Bismillah, alhamdulillah, as-salatu was-salam ala rasulillah. Rabbi shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wa wahlul 'uqdatan min lisani yafqahu qawli. Jazakallahu khairan for coming out tonight, especially the moms in the room. I know it's not easy with children. And I like to begin these talks with several disclaimers to start. It kind of helps the conversation in the Q&A portion. So first and foremost, I just want to make clear that I am not a scholar, I'm not a sheikha, I'm barely even an ustaza. I'm speaking to you as a fellow Muslim, and everything that I have to share, I consider it advice for myself before anybody else. So may Allah make it easy for all of us, may He purify our hearts and make it easy for us to see with clarity the truth, especially in these very difficult times. I was given the privilege by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to be born into Islam, and then I had the utter misfortune of leaving Islam for 10 years. And alhamdulillah, the blessing and the mercy of Allah, our Creator, I was able to return to Him again about a decade later. I share this in order to convey to you that my background does not make me an expert in matters of fiqh. Rather, it's my experience as a formerly lost and depressed atheist that will, inshallah, be of benefit today, as we know that so many brothers and sisters are currently struggling with the sort of things that I struggled with. My career and academic training is in education. I love the science behind learning, child and human development, and I'm especially interested in language and its power. I've been a teacher and a school administrator for almost 10 years, working in private, public, and charter schools in the United States, as well as nonprofit organizations in the field of education. So as you know, I'm here to talk about feminism and women's rights, etc. That means, despite any arguments to the contrary, what I have to say concerns both men and women. This is not just a female problem. Last night, Sheikh Hilal, may Allah reward him, opened the evening with what is probably the most important takeaway of this entire conference. That is, we need to root our understanding of the world in the Quran. He pointed out that doubts are the result of weak iman, not that weak iman later leads to doubts. And as somebody who was lost for an entire decade, I concur thoroughly with this argument. In other words, rather, in fact, were it not for this unfortunate truth, the title of this conference would be something entirely different. We wouldn't be talking about fortifying our minds. As someone who struggled for an entire decade and was destroyed by her doubts, I ask Allah to protect each and every one of us from our weak iman, to increase us in our knowledge and our understanding of the truth with a capital T, and to cure our hearts of its diseases which ultimately lead us astray. Interestingly, I will be approaching the topic of feminism tonight from the same place that Sheikh Hilal has urged us to do. And from what I've been hearing from the participants, a lot of the speakers at the conference have this recurring theme. And I don't know for the mashayikh who have been speaking, but I certainly did not have conversations with the other speakers. So it's amazing, subhanAllah, that we all sort of had the same thinking when it came to developing the talks for this conference. So the title of this talk, Empowering Muslim Women Without Feminism. To be completely honest, I really dislike this title. I dislike it because it reinforces the framework that got us to where we are in the first place. It forces us to talk about Muslim women on feminism's terms rather than on God's terms. And that, as I understand it, is precisely what many scholars today, Sheikh Hilal among them, Imam Zaid Shabir also, are cautioning us not to do. If we truly want to get a grip on what's going on with Muslim women today, and we want to help heal our community from the social diseases inflicted on it by secular ideologies, such as feminism, we need to start by paying closer attention to the words we employ in our discourse about Muslim women. To that end, I'm not going to use the term empower, because this seemingly innocuous buzzword has been co-opted to serve a secular worldview. It's a hurrah word. It's a term whose associations and connotations have not only been taken for granted as good and belonging to those who are good, but it also forces us to accept the claim that women are inherently disempowered. It makes us take for granted the notion that Muslim women have always and continue to lack some sort of power. And from there, it directs us to focus our energy on fighting, sometimes literally, all men in order to gain those lost or missing so-called rights. Both these claims, one, that Muslim women lack a specific kind of power, and that they need to fight the opposite sex to get that power, are arguments that many young Muslim sisters and brothers today have come to accept as self-evident truths. So instead, I propose we talk about today's Muslim woman, her status, her concerns, her grievances, and anything and everything that affects her, not by asking how can we empower Muslim women without feminism, but rather, what is the role of the Muslim woman in the society which her creator, through his divine message and through his prophet's lived example, has made her responsible for helping build and maintain here in the dunya. Asking this question, as opposed to the misleading one that derives from the feminist framework, helps us shift our mindset toward the more accurate solution-generating approach regarding Muslim women. Now, much of what I will say, I'm sure, will sound antiquated, traditional, and outmoded to some of us in the room tonight. And that's because some of us have been conditioned to identify certain terms and ideas as such by the language of liberalism, whether or not we realize it. Language, we must understand, is a system of words that represents a group of organized ideas which work together to reflect a particular worldview. Therefore, speaking today in the West during an era that is captivated by the social justice narrative of postmodernity, I'm aware of the fact, as you should be as well, that the Quranic worldview has been rendered obsolete, barbaric, and misogynistic. I ask that you be critically aware of this thinking pattern throughout the course of this talk. I also want to acknowledge that this talk will do what many of the talks of this conference have been doing, that is challenging the liberal paradigm. I'm asking those of you who are currently experiencing doubts, who are deeply struggling with your iman, to try to suspend those beliefs you have acquired from our modern secular culture. And I know that this is unsettling and that it is threatening, and in many cases it's terrifying. And I empathize because I was there, so I'm not casting any judgment on anyone. So without further ado, let's begin. Let's now paint a picture of today's woman. There seems to have been both progress and decline taking place, not just within the Muslim community in the West, but across all communities in the West since the onset of the feminist movements, which began at the turn of the 20th century. So let's talk about the good that has come out of feminism. We know that women are outpacing men in attaining college education and advanced degrees, according to a US Census Bureau data from 2017. More of them are empowered than ever before, and New York Magazine even declared single women as the most potent political force of our time. We also know that women are more financially independent. These are all, you could argue these are all really good things. They have their benefits. What's the trade-off? What are we sacrificing for these aspects of progress? Despite the fact that more women are more educated than ever before, they're more financially independent, they're also more depressed and anxious about their self-worth and their future than ever before. Today's woman does not know where she stands. Today's woman feels like she's never enough. She feels like she needs to be perfect in and outside the home. She's been taught to believe that she needs to be a leader in both the public and the private spheres. And as a result of juggling so much, as a result of sacrificing time and energy from the private sphere in order to perform in the public sphere, children, youth, Entire families, entire communities, our society as a whole is paying the price. This is not about blaming women. It is about illustrating how incredibly important and valuable they are as mothers. How many of you are familiar with the notion of attachment parenting? Very few. So outside of the Muslim community, there is a huge conversation being had about children and the way that they're being raised today. Non-Muslims are struggling to raise their children, and they're asking themselves, where have we gone wrong? What is it that's happening in our homes where mothers feel they no longer have maternal instinct, fathers are terrified of their own children, parents are at a loss for how to talk to their children, they don't know what to do. What was once considered natural and instinctual is now something that we turn to books and scholars and speakers and psychologists for, and we still don't know what we're doing. So this idea of attachment parenting is the idea that we need to reconnect with our natural God-given instincts for being parents, the way that our parents and their parents were able to raise us without having to think twice about how to approach us. Parents all over the world are at a loss for what to do. So can we imagine what's happening in the Muslim community where family is extremely prized and held to be one of the most important aspects of social life? We've steered so far away from the traditional family structure, and we have toyed with the balance and the order of things so much that we're now utterly confused and blind to our own innate God-given instincts. So a quick summary of the feminist movements and how we've gotten here. As you know, there have been 3 waves, each one with its own set goals, and all have been based on the notion that women are inherently oppressed, that to be born a woman, you are born into a society dictated by a patriarchy, or what I sometimes like to call the big bad boys club. And that women need to be brought out of their gender roles, they need to be taken out of the home and liberated, and that the sphere in which there is power is the public sphere, not the private one. And this is extremely important. This is a critical point. Feminism sees the public sphere, not the private one, as the one in which power exists, and that men have had a monopoly on that power since the beginning of time, and it's only fair that they share that power. Now today, with 3rd wave and 4th wave feminism, there's something called intersectional feminism, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with this notion. And this version of feminism leads the way towards the normalization of LGBTQ identity. We as Muslims, especially the youth, have come to accept the idea of intersectional feminism, whereby women are told that they experience layers of oppression based on their gender, class, ethnicity, and race. And now we are more and more accepting of same-sex tendencies as biological and natural. There also seems to be an emphasis on language now. Linguistics is an area of tremendous concern for today's feminist movement. It's interested in redefining words such that derogatory terms, which I won't repeat, which have always been something that we want to disassociate ourselves from, we're now starting to embrace those terms and trying to reclaim them as part of our womanhood. So again, think about what this implies in terms of language and how language is powerful. We're not even allowed to question what these terms mean. We're not allowed to question whether or not being a feminist is a positive or a negative thing. So how did we get caught up in this movement? This feminism and its trajectory has had nothing to do with Muslims historically. But due to globalization, due to immigration, due to the fact that we have grown up here, we've inherited a lot of these social movements and these social problems. Post 9/11 brought with it the anti-Islamophobia movement, and that in and of itself has its problems, if you ask me. But in our fight for representation, in our fight to be a part of the American community, we're not only revealing that we have an identity crisis where we want to be accepted so badly in the West, but we've also demonstrated that we lack conviction in our own faith. Even while we're trying to defend ourselves and say, we're Muslims, we're on the map, we should be given, the rights that anybody else should have. But we're forfeiting those rights in the name of fighting against Islamophobia. And because we don't have a firm grounding in our deen, and we don't have a firm grounding in which battles we should be fighting and which ones we should not be advocating for, we want to be socially accepted. And it becomes especially more difficult when the person standing to your left and the person standing to your right is a classmate of yours, or a professor, or a mentor, or a friend, and you know their name, and you have a relationship with them, right? So that's one reason why we're getting sucked into it. Another reason why more and more Muslims, especially the sisters, are coming to accept feminist ideology is because there are legitimate grievances in our community, both in the diaspora and in the Muslim world. There is injustice. And we know that these injustices have existed since the beginning of time, right? I mean, our prophets came down to bring adalah and justice to our communities. They are the true social justice warriors, and we should be looking to them for examples on how to bring about justice. But with that being said, with the serious and important and urgent issues facing sisters in the community, they're looking for answers, and they're feeling, for one reason or another, that feminism is that answer. Also, as Muslims, because we believe in justice for all, the language of the social justice movement is very appealing to us, right? It's about justice for all and equality and fairness and this relativism. It's very Christian-y, it's very easy, it's easy on the ego, it's easy on the conscience, it's easy to interact with people when you identify as a liberal progressive, and so for that reason it becomes ever more appealing for us to latch on to feminism. But again, without a firm grounding in our deen, this is what happens to our activism as Muslims. Sister Lina Safi, who earned her bachelor's degree in Islamic law and theology from Zaytuna, she points out that activism on college campuses has become a framework by which to understand the world. The label activist is used to differentiate those who work against systemic injustices from those who do not. So imagine that dichotomy now. You're either an SJW or you're not. You're either fighting the good fight or you're not. You're either for all rights or you're not. So there's no room for the gray zone. There's no room to say, I believe we should treat everyone with dignity and respect, but I do not believe in same-sex marriage. I believe that everybody should be treated with dignity and respect, but I do not believe that we should conflate women's rights with feminism. There's no room for that. There's no nuance. So to not engage for any reason is to be on the bad side. And Sister Lina is spot on, I think, in her observation today when she says the following. Today, Muslims are too shallowly engaging Islam to be transformed by it, let alone for them to then transform society through it. Being a Muslim has become an identity marker just like any other, stripping it of its vertical meaning and attachment to the divine. When being grounded by its vertical reality is how a person will be catapulted forward in its horizontal aspect with inspiration. So let's talk about what activism then needs to look like if we want to talk about women's rights. Oppression and injustice, as I mentioned, has existed as long as humankind has, because by our very nature, we are not infallible. And we have a tendency to oppress both our souls and the souls of others. All the prophets, blessings and peace be upon them, fought against severe injustices. The destitute and the downtrodden were loved so dearly by the Messenger of Allah, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and he devoted himself to their service. His lived example shows us how that we are required as Muslims to defend the humanity of every human being. This is social justice before today's social justice era. But because of the paradigm in which we live here in the West, we fail to recognize the distinctive difference between secular social justice movements and the divinely inspired social justice pathway as exemplified by our Prophet. As a result, we all too often take part in and expend a great deal of time, energy, and resources investing in a materialistic and atheistic framework. And the result is ultimately kufr. Imam Zayd Shakir, may Allah reward him, reminds us that every action the believer undertakes must be informed by knowledge of the divine law. Therefore, before we engage in any sort of act, before we choose to call ourselves feminists, we must try to learn the legal ruling relating to it in terms of its permissibility and impermissibility, along with its lawful and unlawful aspects. The Quran tells us what our priorities should be when it comes to establishing and maintaining a healthy, balanced society. So once again, the question is not how do we empower Muslim women without feminism, it's how do we remind ourselves of our role within the greater society. Let us move away from this individualistic point of view about me, my rights, my rights, my rights. What is the holistic society that we should be building? In Surah Al-Baqarah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reveals the unity between the worldly and the spiritual. He tells us, "It is not righteousness to orient your faces east or west in prayer. Rather, righteousness is to believe in God, doomsday, the angels, the scriptures, and the prophets. It is to spend wealth despite the love for it, for the relative, the orphan, the poor, wayfarers, beggars, and for the liberation of slaves. It's to establish regular prayers, pay the poor due, and to faithfully fulfill covenants, having convened them." And Imam Zaid Shakir helps us interpret and understand this ayah. I want to therefore put a plug for this book, especially for sisters who are struggling and brothers who are struggling with this issue of feminism. It's called Towards Sacred Activism by Imam Dawood Walid. As a family is the foundation of society, social action begins close to home, with spending for the well-being of relatives and then orphans. So number one, you begin with yourself. We must begin with ourselves. And we hear this so many times that it's now going in through one ear and out the other. But how much time do we actually devote to developing ourselves? How much time are we actually allotting? And are we consciously allotting that time to develop ourselves? It might be easier for the brothers than the sisters because of their duties at home with children. It's incumbent upon brothers to assist their wives in carving out that time so that they can develop themselves as well. So practically speaking, when it comes to conferences like this, are we making time for sisters to hand over the children so that they can have time to actually engage in these conference lectures? Last night when the program was taking place, I really empathized with the mothers up there because they were trying to pay attention and children were running around, there was a lot going on. It's very difficult. Being physically present and also being mentally present are two different things. So we have to assist sisters if we expect them to thrive as wives and as mothers. Okay, so we start with ourselves first and foremost. And then the family, your immediate family. From there, the orphans, and then the rest of society. But what we find ourselves doing is the inverse. We spend so much time on social justice, social justice, social justice. I have to do for society. Don't worry about society. You're doing nothing for society if you yourself are not right with God. The Prophet ﷺ dedicated the vast majority of his life, had divine revelation, and he could not change the heart of every human being. What makes you think you are going to? This hubris that we have, where we think, I'm the next leader, I'm the one who's going to, help change Muslims. It's a beautiful and very noble intention, but check that intention because you are not ultimately the one that is going to change anybody. It's up to Allah. And we have to remember that. That's where the divine comes in our activism. So those are what our priorities need to be when we're thinking about women and their rights. It's not about what you're missing out on. First and foremost, you need to look at yourself and you need to look at your family. So let's talk about the balanced society that the Quran and the Hadith teaches us about. Let's think of this in terms of a sports team or government or an institution. They're made up of roles, right? And positions. Everybody fills a role, you know what your title is, you have a clear job description, you don't step on your manager's toes, you don't step on your colleague's toes, and when you do, what happens? You're ostracized, right? You're seen as arrogant or out of place, and you check yourself. It's the same thing in a family. Everybody has their role, everybody has their job description. And so when a family unit that is made up of roles and positions is filled and mastered, that's when we have a very healthy community. Each person understands and is committed to playing their role. We own that role with pride. That's when a family will thrive, and that's how it has traditionally thrived. But we, again, have steered so far away from this because feminism tells us that we need to play the role that men have traditionally played. Why? Because supposedly we're oppressed. Supposedly we are disempowered. Supposedly, from the beginning of time, we have been blind to the fact that they've been meeting up in conference rooms, planning how to keep us out of power. Does that make any sense? According to a well-known hadith, the The Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, each of you is a shepherd, and each of you is responsible for his flock. The Amir, the ruler who is over the people, is a shepherd and is responsible for his flock. A man is a shepherd in charge of the inhabitants of his household, and he's responsible for his flock. A woman is a shepherdess in charge of her husband's house and children, and she's responsible for them. And a man-slave is a shepherd in charge of his master's property, and he's responsible for it. So each of you is a shepherd, and each of you is responsible for his flock. This is very different from what feminism tells us about power. Feminism tells us that power is in which sphere? The public sphere. And what sphere lacks power? The private sphere. Even among sisters who are dedicated to their families and homes, we really truly believe we are not enough if all we're ever doing is working in the private sphere. Said, that is a very powerful place. And as trite and cliche as it may sound, these guys would not exist if it wasn't for you. Who raised them? Their dads? Maybe in some cases. Your mothers. Right? Mama, ummi. The most important part of any society, the dedicated mother who masters her role, who understands every cry, every smile, every twitch of her child, and can respond to it. That's not an easy job. It's a 24/7 job. You don't get days off, right? You don't get weekends off. So for the feminists who say that's an insignificant job, where did you get that from? In Surah Al-Baqarah, it's also said, they are a garment for you and you are a garment for them. The husband and wife are the bedrock of the family unit. The relationship between the husband and the wife is so vital. If it is not healthy, who's going to suffer? Your children, right? If the wife continuously feels like she needs to be amazing in and outside the home and she's stressed out all the time, who's going to feel it? Before the kids. The husband. How many of you get stressed out when your wives come home from work? It's stressful. When you're stressed, he's stressed. And when you're both stressed, your kids are stressed. And they feel it. In Surah An-Nisa, الرجال قوامون على النساء. Meaning, as you all know, men are the protectors of women. Once again, they are in charge of us, not in the sense that they are meant to oppress us. In fact, what is really being said there is they have to answer to Allah for our well-being. I don't know about you, but I don't want that responsibility. That's a big responsibility. I'm not trying to scare you. Okay? But they have an added layer of responsibility. Not only do men have to perform in the public sphere, they have a duty in the private sphere as well. When you're done working outside, making money for the family, putting food on the table, you need to come inside. Your children need their father. You still have a role to play that your wife cannot play. And psychologists are proving, this is where same-sex attraction comes from. I encourage you to look up the work of a psychologist named Joseph Nicolosi. His theory is that same-sex attraction generates from the poor relationship between the boy and his father. Oftentimes, the boy is extremely attached to the mother. Even if the father is physically present, if there is not a strong relationship with the boy, that longing for affection transfers itself into sexual attraction later on in life. Look at how important the role of the father is. He doesn't get to take a break when he comes home. So we as mothers and wives, we need to step out of the way. There's a reason Allah endowed him with those traits. Your kids need that. It's not for you to do it. You have your part, and he needs to step out the way so you can do that part. But this is where the balance comes in. So think of it that way. When the father comes home, he has a role to play. It's still important too. And I see way too many sisters disempowering and emasculating men. You need to stop that because your kids are going to pay for it. They are. I was sitting at Panera about a year ago, and I felt really bad for this guy. They're sitting there, and they've got a young boy, and the woman just went in on him. Totally embarrassed him in front of the boy. 10 minutes later, the boy did something, the father tried to correct him. How do you think the boy responded to his dad? The same exact statements that the mother hurled at the father, the boy repeated. watch how you talk to each other. Your kids are paying attention to that, and they will come back and respond to you that way as well. Okay, let me keep moving because I know time is of the essence. So, going back to the idea of the public and the private spheres. While each sphere is designated its leaders, women are the leaders in the private sphere, men are the leaders in the public sphere. Again, we're both expected to support one another. Let's take a look at what the Quran and Hadith tell us about this. In Sahih Bukhari, it is narrated that Abu Hurairah, may Allah be pleased with him, said that the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam kissed Al-Hassan ibn Ali when Al-Iqra ibn Habis al-Tamimi, sorry my pronunciation is very poor, was sitting with him. Al-Iqra said, I have 10 children and I have never kissed one of them. The Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam looked at him and said, the one who does not show mercy will not be shown mercy. Look at how the softness is encouraged in Islam. The father does not always need to be this strict, firm, tough guy, right? He also needs to show compassion and love to his children. Aisha radiallahu anha reported that some Bedouins came to the Prophet alayhi salam and asked, do you kiss your children? He replied, yes. Then they said, by Allah, we do not kiss them. And he said, I cannot help you if Allah has snatched kindness from your hearts. Fathers are also responsible for providing elements of parenting that mothers cannot. And therefore, once again, I just want to say that when we're thinking about women's rights, we have to also pay attention to the fact that they have a role too. And they need to rise up and fulfill that role, but they can't do it without us encouraging them. And so the more that we toy with this balance, the more future generations are suffering as a result of it. So if we want to think about power, why don't we say to ourselves that power is recognizing the role that we were created for, valuing it and mastering it. The more that time passes, the more I start to admire and want to emulate stay-at-home moms. Like, I just had my first child 3 months ago. I spent a month in New York so that I could be near my mom and some of her closest friends because I'm 33. I had children later on in life. I didn't really spend time around women raising children. And so I was at a loss for what to do. So I threw myself into that environment. A month was not enough, but the things that we take for granted that our moms are able to do, it's amazing. It's amazing. At the beginning of this talk, I asked you to suspend your judgment. If you were able to do so, it's most likely because you already see women's rights through the lens of Islam and traditionalism. And if you found it difficult to do so, if you found anything I said offensive, it's probably due to the likelihood that you have imbibed or absorbed the postmodern paradigm. This paradigm has conditioned us to register certain words and ideas as barbaric and antiquated. So in changing our approach by saying we're not going to keep talking about women on feminism's terms, that's truly rewriting the narrative. Today's fitnas also are very sophisticated. In other words, the closer we approach Yom al-Qiyamah, the more difficult it will be for our ummah to walk the straight path. We know this. We've been warned over and over again. And the fact that we have to keep having these conversations about women's rights, something that used to be taken for granted, is now so confusing and clouded, is a symbol and an example of the fact that today's fitna is very sophisticated. Both men and women have to understand and value womanhood. I do not deny that in our cultures, Arab, Daisy, whatever, we have problems. We absolutely have problems. But it's not because there's an issue with Islam. It's an issue with culture. So you know it. So we know this. Let's stop turning to all these isms and ideologies to help us solve our problems. Allah gave us the only book that we need. All the answers are there. Put away your sociology books, put away your philosophy books, put away your gender and women's studies books. You don't need them. Take it from somebody who went down that path. Okay, I've experienced it. It's not going to get you the answer, I promise. Go back to the text, the one and only text that you need. Yesterday, a beautiful 12-year-old Muslim girl asked me, what is feminism? And honestly, I didn't know how to respond to her. Like, where do we begin with this question with our youth? How do we even start? Instead of getting caught in the arguments, as some speakers at this conference have very eloquently explained to us, we keep getting caught up in these arguments. We don't need to get caught up in these arguments. Go back to basics, right? Because if you think women need empowerment, then you're saying that Allah put them on this earth disempowered to begin with. Therefore, you're saying God is unjust. Astaghfirullah. Follow this language to its logical conclusion. It's not going to make sense. So I'll end there. I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to purify our hearts, that we may be able to see more clearly. I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to protect and guide us, to keep us diligent in our prayers, and to turn to Him, always back to Him. May Allah protect and guide our youth, the children, our future generations, and may He instill in them the courage and conviction necessary to navigate this dunya. Jazakallahu khairan.
So right now, for the last 10-15 minutes, we're just going to do some questions. So I wanted to ask a few questions first. One thing I was wondering, because you mentioned in the beginning, this is for both men and women. So how can Muslim men approach this topic and try to cause change as well? Because it's not just the women who need to start initiating the narrative.
First and foremost, let's look at the seerah of the Prophet. How did he treat his wives? How many of us are living that example of the Prophet alayhi salam? It's really as basic as that. The answer is basic, but the execution is much more challenging. But we have to begin there. Have more patience. The issues that sisters are dealing with are not easy. And you guys know that being a hijab, it makes you way more visibly Muslim. And the identity crisis that sisters are facing it just adds a layer of difficulty for them. So have patience with your wives, your sisters, your cousins, and other, Muslim sisters in the community. Be compassionate in your conversations and your comments. Don't write them off. If they say something that registers as feminist to you, they're processing this. It's not easy. It's a very complicated and complex issue and situation. So I would always turn back to the example of the Prophet, how he spoke with women, how he spoke about women, the manner in which he was apologetic, the chances that he gave them over and over again to correct themselves. Have that kind of graciousness and mercy.
And this is a little bit different, but I was curious because from my own experiences, like how do you respond to certain feminists who declare that feminism is not actually about equality, because this is more of like the fifth generation and fourth generation, but they say it's about equity.
Well, first, how do they define equity?
More like getting equal opportunity, for example, towards certain, like if you say job opportunities or whatever it is that men can have, not necessarily do, that women should also have.
But that's equality. Exactly. Not equity. What's the difference between equity and equality? Yes.
Equity is more where based on people, they're actually considered with their abilities, and then your resources are allocated based on that. Or for example, if men are good at lifting and women are good at caregiving, that's equity.
Yeah.
Versus equality is they're both expected to do both equally when they're both responsible.
Yeah. Exactly. I mean, you hit the nail on the head. See, again, the problem is that we have allowed ourselves to believe that the responsibilities that take place in the private sphere are insignificant, that they are oppressive, and that it's just being a mother, it's just being a wife, it's just being a stay-at-home mom, right? We have to change our thinking of what being a mother and a wife means. That comes with reframing our worldview. We have to look at it from a Quranic perspective. If you continuously are trying to talk about women, their roles, their responsibilities, if you want to talk about God's existence, if you want to talk about atheism, if you want to talk about anything that you have any doubts about, if you're doing it through a non-Quranic Arabic language, you are more than likely going to end up seeing Islam as barbaric, because it's designed to get you to draw that conclusion. But we keep entering these conversations with, oh no, but Muslim women have rights. It's not about proving that the Quran also gives Muslim women rights. Let's ask ourselves, what does a healthy society look like? What are the components of a healthy society? And then you start discussing that, and you will naturally find that a woman's responsibilities, her duty, her place, her power, her kingdom is in the private sphere. She calls the shots in there. As an educator, I honestly don't know if there's anything more powerful than being a teacher of young children. It's exhausting. Sometimes you feel like ripping your hair out of your head. I get it. It's not easy. But you're shaping minds. That is the most important work out there. Does that answer your question?
So, like, to end kind of, I just wanted to ask, what kind of piece of advice would you give to our Muslim, like young Muslim women, teenagers, that sort of thing, and about speaking regarding the truth and speaking against feminism?
Us young Muslims, we have a serious identity crisis. We have very low self-esteem. I'm going to just put it out there. There was a brother giving I think it was Brother Muhammad Hijab, giving a workshop. And he was asking folks to come up to the front. And one of the first things he said was, you need to stand with confidence. Why are you slouching? Why are your shoulders hunched over? Stand up, stand firm. You are a Muslim, for God's sake. Have conviction in what that means. And it's the same thing when it comes to feminism. Let's develop a little bit of confidence in what it means to be a mother and a wife. I'm not saying that you can't work outside the home. I've been working outside the home since I was 15, so I'd be a hypocrite if I made that argument. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that is secondary to your role in the private sphere. There's tremendous power in the private sphere. So the answer to that is have some self-esteem. Sorry, I'm being very blunt right now, but I feel like I need
It says, my wife and I both have to work to make ends meet. I want to make sure my daughters are educated because our mother are our first teachers, and also to ensure her independence in case of divorce of being widowed. Can you please comment on this, sister?
So there's two things regarding this comment that I want to point out. One, it emphasizes the importance of community. Yet again, this is why the Western way of mother, father, children staying in their own homes, nobody gets involved in raising the kids except those parents. That's why this doesn't work, right? The traditional method is you have an entire village raising children. This is very, very important. You need multi-generations to help raise children. The importance of having different age groups around your children at all times so that they're developing. So that's one thing. The other thing is, how many of us are taking a critical look at our finances and our family and really asking ourselves, do we need this money at the expense of our children? Now, I'm not saying that whoever wrote this comment that you both don't need to work. I grew up in a household where my mom had to go out and work at one point in time, so I understand that it's a necessity. May Allah make it easier for these families. But for many of us, especially those of us who have college degrees, we need to learn how to live within our means and to downsize because the cost keeps falling on the children. And I say this as somebody who has recently had to do this. After having my child, my husband and I had to really sit down, or actually before having our child, we have to sit down and say, okay, so is he going to daycare? Are we getting a nanny? So my husband and I sat down, we took a look at our finances, we got a financial advisor, we said, look, one of us is going to slash her income. I'm not working, I'm going to be a full-time stay-at-home mom. We need to learn to live on my husband's income. And Allah will provide from there. So we spent about 6 months figuring it out. We started going through like a process of downsizing. We moved, we got rid of a lot of things. We just reworked our life. And it's a sacrifice. It's not easy, it takes time. But in our opinion, it is the important thing to do. You're the best person to take care of your child. Your child was in your body for 9 months. Nobody is better equipped to do that work except for you. So.
The next one is, what advice can you give to Muslim women who hold the correct Islamic values and try to implement them, but face shame from within the Ummah itself for being stay-at-home moms?
You need to have confidence. If you feel shame, in large part, it's because you yourself kind of agree with what they're saying. You yourself have that mentality. And I'm not saying this to be like harsh and whatever, but if you believe something and somebody comes and tells you otherwise, you're not going to be shaken by it. But if you are shaken by anything somebody says, that's like when a Muslim has doubts about God's existence and somebody comes and says the slightest thing about, the transcendent, it's like, yeah, maybe he's right. Maybe that's true. So start with yourself, ask yourself, why is it that I believe exactly what they're accusing me of? Because you hold that belief yourself.
So the next question says, how can we encourage women to stay at home if they are not obligated to work for financial reasons? How would such an argument be?
Okay, first and foremost, here we go. You guys, a lot of you rely on your wives to bring in money. And you have to start being honest with yourselves. You have to start being honest with yourselves. If we expect sisters to live according to what Allah has decreed, they are not obligated to contribute financially. So let's not manipulate our wives into working outside the home. This happens way too often, especially among millennials, because we have a certain standard of living that we want to reach, and maybe our income is just shy of that, and it's like, well, she's all about feminism anyway, she wants to work outside the home. Girl, pay some bills. No. You know what you're doing. So, once again, this is why you guys need to be careful when you're like, I should be able to do what a man does. Do you know what you're bargaining for? Now, I'm not saying this as a blanket statement. I know that in some households you have to contribute. I've had to do it too. If your husband needs help, it's your responsibility to help him. You should help him. It's the right thing to do for your family. But you don't need to be doing it permanently, and Allah is not requiring you to do it. Okay, so it's a two-pronged answer. Okay, so this question is, how do we address and approach the youth who are brought up in an individualistic society? How many of you know very well who your children's friends are? Raise your hands. How many of you know very well who your children's teachers are? Okay, I highly encourage you to start taking very seriously who your children are being educated by. I'm speaking to you as a teacher. You won't believe some of the things teachers say to children. Don't worry, it's okay, wait till you're 18. I know your family is so strict. Man, I feel sorry for you. It's okay. I'm always here for you. They mean well. These are well-meaning educators, but they have a different worldview. And your children are spending 7-8 hours with them. Get to know your teachers. So yeah, I would say just pay attention to who your children are surrounded by, for sure. How do you explain to your husband that you want to focus more on being a mother and a wife and not feel guilty for saying you don't have capacity to work and provide at the same time? I think I already answered this. Look at the finances. Root your argument in the Quran, right? You have your rights as a woman. You have your realm as a woman. You have your role as a woman. And it might take your husband a little bit of time to understand that, but be persistent. And if you need to involve, the sheikh at your masjid or a trusted family friend, then do so. So let me get this straight. A woman can do whatever a man can do, but a man can't talk about women's issues. But a woman can talk about men's issues. Does that make sense? Okay, fine. How about this? We're supposed to follow the example of the Prophet. He was a man. He wasn't just an example for men, he was an example for us too, right? So we just are going to ignore the fact that he was a man? That's not to say that okay, men understand every single thing a woman goes through, the same way that we don't get them sometimes, right? don't buy into this feminist idea that it's you versus them. If you keep doing that, you're gonna lose. Your kids are gonna lose. You need them. They need you. You're dependent on each other. They have, abilities and capabilities that we don't have, right? So you gotta cooperate. Humans are social dependent beings. And so for the men, just remind them of that. Remind your women of what you're contributing. Don't throw it in their faces and be argumentative about it. Again, use the Prophet Sita as the example.
Okay, the next question says, how come do we ask for equality with men if we have biological differences? How do feminists respond to this?
Okay, so remember how I was talking about intersectionality and the LGBTQ social justice movement? So right now, we're being force-fed this idea that gender is a social construct, that gender is a performance, that there's no such thing as male, female, gender's fluid, you can be an it, you can be a unicorn, you can be a, whatever you want, right? I'm being a little facetious, but it's serious. So if right now the ideology is that gender is a social construct, you have to go back to that. You have to go back to the biological arguments that there is inherently a difference between men and women. There are scientists and scholars out there advocating for us to go back to basics. There is just a slew of studies on this very matter and getting us to go back to the natural truth of what's going on.
The next question says, how do Muslim women deal with abuse in the name of religion? I feel like this is a taboo issue that the community does talk about, but this is a reality. Example, you can't work and it's preferred for you to stay at home.
Okay. So what I'm hearing in this question is that it's abusive to not work. It's abusive for you to stay at home. And that the religion is enforcing that. Am I reading that right? Okay. So we did this in the workshop. Raise your hand if you're a Muslim. The brothers can't see. Raise your hand if you're a Muslim sister. Raise your hand if you're a Muslim sister who is of working age. Keep your hand up if you work. Keep your hand up if your husband permits you to work. Or your father, whoever your wali is. Okay. Keep your hand up if your wali refuses to allow you to work. Literally 0 hands. 0. So there's a difference between the stereotype that Muslim women are not allowed to work. If anything, and I said this before, if anything, the issue in our community is that brothers are actually encouraging it. That's actually the problem. It's not haram for you to work outside the home. Again, your argument in the Quran, if it's permissible and your family is not going to suffer because of it, have a conversation with your husband. Forget about the idea that it's taboo and the community. Forget about the community. You just proved it by a raise of hands. Those of you who can work are working. And I bet a lot of you don't want to be, actually, because it's exhausting. Right? You want to when you're in college because it sounds great and glamorous, and then you go out to the real world and you're like, this sucks. I don't want to do this anymore.
So we know that kids learn the most by example, so isn't it better for moms to be activists rather than mere housewives if they want them also to be activists in society?
Great. What is our #1 goal here on earth in the dunya? Say it, you know the answer.
As moms, to ensure that our kids become our
All humans, not just women. What's our goal here?
Please Allah.
To worship Allah. We're slaves of Allah. We have to keep that front and center. Everything else is secondary to that. So the idea that if we want them to also be activists in society, said who? Right? Allah did not say, first and foremost, go out and change the world. Once again, the prophets themselves were not able to change every heart. What makes you think you're going to do that? Be realistic in your expectations of yourself. No one's saying that you shouldn't go out and do da'wah. Of course. But that is like an afterthought. to everything else that you have to do first. Priorities. These things are cumulative. Before you want your daughters and your sons to be activists, what should you be focusing on? What should you be instilling in them? Iman, Aqidah, right? They have to, first we had that list from the book that I told you about. Number 1 is the self, then the immediate family, the orphans and the misfortunate in our community, right? And then we expand, we go into our outer circle. Not the other way around. In our society, in our secular society, we're made to think that we need to start, outside. How?
And we're going to start with the next round of speakers in Shogo. So,